Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another brand new episode of the Word of the Day podcast. My name is Jamie Silva. I am your host, and I have just one mission today, and that is to pleasantly explain another useful word to you all. And here to help me do so, please welcome back to the program for her second appearance, the very talented voice actor Emily. Emily, thanks for joining us again.
Thank you for having me again.
Now, just a quick note before we begin. I'm not sure when this episode will air, but we are recording it in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic. And I'm sure all you out there listening have the utmost concern and solicitude. That's episode 19, by the way, solicitude. You have the utmost solicitude for my health, for Emily's health, and of course, that of the entire Word of the Day staff. Well, folks, I can assure you that we are taking a range of precautions to keep everyone here at the show safe. For instance, instead of recording in the RAV4 studios, as we are wont to do, we are in Emily's house. We each have our own microphones, and we're seated at opposite ends of a nice, long table. Like, you know, the kind you see in movies, where solitary, aristocratic couples in ancient mansions or castles get dressed up every night in fancy dinner attire and sit at opposite ends of like a 6-foot by 60-foot dining table and are waited upon by a silent butler who has to walk the entire length of the table every time they need some more roast pheasant.
Jamie, this is just a normal table.
Well, okay, then what's that in the middle there on the big platter?
It's pheasant.
Well, okay then.
So what if I like pheasant? This is still just a normal-sized table. I don't live in a medieval castle, okay?
Be that as it may, the point is we're sitting plenty far apart, and every 10 minutes we have the Word of the Day sanitation squad come in here, wipe down everything, and spray Emily's whole dining room with disinfectant.
Yeah, last time they didn't even wait for me to leave the room before spraying.
Oh, they're just passionate about cleanliness, Emily. What can I say? So anyway, now that we've put to rest any concerns you might have for our health, and thank you, it's time to introduce you to today's word, which is the verb commandeer. In my opinion, commandeer means to take over or assume charge of something.
So, for example, if you were out fishing with a friend and you hooked a big one and you were reeling it in, well, say your friend was like, Here, let me hold your fishing rod while you get the net to scoop it out with. And then instead of giving the rod back after you fetch the net, your friend went ahead and reeled the fish in the rest of the way himself. In this scenario, you might accuse him of commandeering your fishing rod, right? Like he took your fishing pole and he took over the task of reeling in the fish. You could say he put himself in charge when before you were handling it.
Commandeer reminds me a lot of the word foist, which we covered in episode 45. And foist just means giving something to someone whether they want it or not. Well, with commandeer, you take it from them whether they like it or not. We had an example in that episode on foist where if you wanted to spread the word about this show, you could queue up an episode on your phone and then force one of your friends to listen to it by jamming your earbuds in their ears. That's what foisting the show on them would look like. Well, a slightly less rude alternative might be commandeering your friend's phone, opening their podcast app, and subscribing them to the program.
Yeah, that's how Jamie got me. Or at least got me subscribed.
Sorry, what was that?
Nothing. Let's talk about the Google definitions for commandeer, of which there are 3. They're all helpful, so let's consider them in turn. First, quote, to officially take possession or control of something, especially for military purposes, unquote. So, for sure, this is the traditional technical meaning of commandeer, and it's frequently seen in times of war, when governments occasionally decide that the safety and survival of the country requires that they take control of certain privately owned things like factories or ships, or raw materials like iron or wheat.
Yeah. Private ships in particular, I think I always would read about getting commandeered in wartime. Because if a government needs a bigger navy, stat, well, ships take a while to build. And it's a lot simpler and quicker just to tell private ship owners, sorry, we're going to need your ships for a while, and we promise to give them back to you in tip-top shape, unless they get sunk during a naval battle.
Or commandeered by pirates.
Yes. In which case, well, we'll feel bad about that.
Exactly. Sometimes the government gives back what they took after the war or emergency or whatever it was is over. But sometimes they don't. I mean, if they commandeered commodities like grain or steel, they can't give those back because they get eaten or turned into rifles. But return or no, if they don't pay, it qualifies as commandeering.
Sure, and governments will seldom pay the private owner when they take something. If they do, I think it then becomes requisitioning, which is a related word to commandeer, meaning to make an official request to use or take something. And this is also often used in these military contexts. Best I can tell, it means about the same thing as commandeer, except that with requisition, the government usually pays for the stuff they take. Maybe not fair market value, and perhaps it's just an IOU, but it's at least something.
Back to commandeering, this can take the form of soldiers marching into a truck factory and being like, okay guys, we're in charge now, and we're going to need you to give us all the trucks you've been making while we stand around and make sure no one misbehaves. This is the more aggressive version. But let's say the president issued an order to have the factory make Humvees or tanks or what have you. Very civil, very orderly, no direct threat of violence, and no government officials or soldiers physically in the factory. But the factory owners still have to obey, so it's still commandeering. This is a controversial practice, and many governments abuse it, but there is at least some ostensible rationale for it, right? National defense.
Sure. The second definition of commandeer, though, dispenses with this rationale. It goes, quote, to take possession of something without authority, unquote. Okay, the without authority part here is key. I mean, taking it without permission from the person you took it from sort of goes without saying. But sometimes you might have legal authority from someone else, someone higher up, who authorized the taking or borrowing. But this definition focuses on situations where you take or take charge of something without permission or authorization from anyone at all.
This sense of commandeer is much more common in ordinary conversation because people aren't involved in military commandeerings or requisitionings very often, right? But people sort of informally take things over from others all the time. We already gave one example above about the fishing rod, but there are many others.
There certainly are. For example, if you're out at happy hour with some friends, and they're the indecisive type that takes ages to pick what they want to eat, you might commandeer the happy hour menu yourself and order, say, a plate of nachos and some buffalo-style pheasant wings to get things started.
Or if you and those friends are toasting marshmallows together and one of them isn't rotating their marshmallow properly, such that it's getting all charred on one side while still being uncooked on the other, and it's starting to droop off the skewer and fall into the fire and be ruined, and it's a marshmallow emergency, and as a good American, you can't just stand by and let that happen? Well, you might say to them, here, give me your roasting stick for a sec. And then you rotate the marshmallow so it toasts on the other side all evenly, thus saving the s'more and the day and America. In this scenario, you could say that you heroically commandeered your friend's marshmallow skewer.
Heroically?
Yeah, they'd be so grateful and everyone around the campfire would cheer. Heck, you'd be the toast of the camping trip. Toast? Like a marshmallow?
Okay. Folks, I'm sorry, to be serious for a moment. This marshmallow situation highlights some more important facets of commandeering, such as that although the word is sort of pejorative, right? Like taking stuff from people sounds bad, a lot of times it's arguably for the best. It's intended to avert some impending catastrophe or help out in some way. Or at least that's what the person doing the commandeering would probably say. Again, the person temporarily having to surrender control of something they were using or something they own may not see it the same way.
Now, in polite company, people rarely just strong-arm someone into handing something over. Instead, they merely apply some peer pressure, often while noting that they won't use the thing for long, and they plan to return it unharmed. So, in order to help you notice when commandeering is happening to you, or when you do it yourself, because you almost certainly do, here are some things people often say as they politely, or not so politely, commandeer things.
Oh, let me borrow that for a minute.
Just hand it over. I'll do it.
Hey, my turn. You've had it all this time. I want to try.
That's not how you... Here, just let me do it.
Oh, don't worry about it. Here, let me handle it.
Oh, yeah, those can be a little tricky. Here, I can do it.
Let me give you a hand with that.
Hey, could I grab that for a sec?
Right, so yeah, if you hear one of these sentences, commandeering is probably happening to you. In my experience, it's usually objects, physical stuff that can be used temporarily and then returned to the owner or the previous user. And I say previous user because these objects don't have to be the personal, private property of whoever they're taken from. They could also be public property or sort of general use.
Yeah, think of how you might commandeer a barbecue at a park or a public volleyball net at the beach. If other people were using it at the time, or they had just stepped away for a minute, that would be extra commandeery.
Which is not a word.
But I think even if no one was using them and you snagged them fair and square on a first-come, first-served basis, that's still commandeering, just a weaker, less confrontational, less controversial form of it.
Now, although, as I just said, commandeering is usually of objects and physical things, it's possible to commandeer abstract, non-physical things as well. So think of like a little office birthday party with a cake and a card that everyone signs and all that stuff. Well, if coworker Steve just got promoted and he barged into the break room with a frosting bag, crossed out "Happy Birthday, Susan" on the cake, and wrote "Congratulations on the promotion, Steve" in its place, and then gave a short speech about his bold vision for the company, you could say that Steve took over, he took control of, or he commandeered that party.
Another thing people commandeer all the time is conversations. So, if a group of people are talking about something, and then someone walks up and introduces a new subject and makes everyone talk about that instead, well, they've just commandeered the conversation, which is, I should say, rather rude.
It certainly is, unless the previous topic was boring or uncomfortable or offensive. In that scenario, most everyone would be glad you commandeered the conversation. It would be welcome. It'd be a charitable act. It'd be...
heroic?
Sure, why not? And by the way, if you ever want to commandeer a conversation by bringing up a new topic, we highly recommend doing so by saying apropos of nothing, a technique we discussed in episode 85 on apropos.
So you could commandeer a dull conversation by saying, apropos of nothing, lately I've been listening to this unimaginably informative and superlatively entertaining podcast where useful words are pleasantly explained.
Exactly. Now, there's a parallel between commandeer and another word that isn't interesting or useful enough to get its own whole episode, but is still worth a quick mention here, and this is the verb appropriate. This is spelled exactly like the adjective appropriate, but again pronounced appropriate.
According to Google, the verb means, quote, to take something for one's own use, typically without the owner's permission, unquote. So, to steal something, basically. And commandeer is actually listed as a synonym for appropriate. To use it in a sentence, one might say, Timmy had the bad habit of breaking his toys, and then appropriating his younger brother's playthings, and mistreating them too.
Now, I tend not to use appropriate much myself, because it's confusing. Like, people think you're mispronouncing and misusing the adjective appropriate. Also, other words, including commandeer, will do just as well. But hey, it's out there, so you can say it if you want.
There's one final definition of commandeer that you don't hear as often, but is still pretty useful. This goes, quote, to enlist someone to help in a task, typically against the person's will, unquote. You can see the underlying military connotations or origins of this, right? Like, if you get conscripted or drafted into the army, you have been, in this sense, commandeered.
True, but again, this sense works in tons of non-military settings as well. So if someone's like, hey, we need some people to help set the table for dinner, how about you and Jen and Lawrence give us a hand? Well then, you and Jen and Lawrence have been commandeered. That is, involuntarily signed up to do a task. You have been volunteered as tribute, so to speak. Now, this doesn't mean that you're straight up forced to help, and will do so kicking and screaming. In fact, when you were recruited, you probably said, oh, of course, I'd be happy to help. But you didn't volunteer voluntarily. So that means you were commandeered.
Of course, people get commandeered for things all the time, often, but not necessarily light physical labor of some sort. Like, you're standing around, probably with some friends, and someone's like, hey, could I borrow you guys for a second? I'm trying to move the piano to the backyard, and I could use a hand. And since you're a helpful sort of person, or at least want to be seen as such, you probably go along with the commandeering and lend a hand.
Okay, it's now time to get some examples of how to use commandeer in ordinary conversation or writing. Example number 1. Brenda never felt up to the task of taking group pictures, especially since she wasn't accustomed to all these newfangled camera phones, what with their selfie sticks and portrait modes and filters and everything. So she was glad when some younger member of the group would commandeer her phone and take the picture instead.
Example number 2. Excuse me, dears, could I commandeer a few of you strapping, handsome young men for a minute? Interjected Mrs. Murphy. It's just, we need to move the ping pong table out of the way to make room for the ice cream sundae station. It'll just take a minute. Thank you so much. Oh, and by the way, it is standard practice and just the polite thing to do when commandeering people for a task to compliment them on their fitness, youth, and/or helpful dispositions.
Yes, this type of compliment, the kind you say in order to get people to do something for you, is called a blandishment. And we covered this word in episode 15. Anyway, moving along. Example number 3. Although the city council meeting was supposed to discuss a resolution allowing food trucks to set up shop in the historic downtown, Councilman Williams commandeered the meeting agenda and insisted on calling a vote on whether fusion cuisine counts as cultural appropriation, and if so, by whom. And by the way, I wrote this example because the phrase cultural appropriation is the primary and perhaps the only way people use the verb appropriate these days.
Unless you're on the Congressional Appropriations Committee, and who knows what they do.
Folks, look it up if you want. It's honestly not interesting at all.
Moving along. Example number 4 is appropriated from War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. Quote, everything precious and valuable had been removed to to a nearby Russian city. 70 bushels of grain had also been carted away. The hay and the spring corn, of which there had been a remarkable crop that year, had been commandeered by the troops and mown down while still green. The peasants were ruined. Notice that there is no mention of the peasants getting paid here, in which case the hay and the spring corn likely would have been requisitioned, not commandeered. Hence, the poor peasants were ruined.
Yeah, it's no fun being a peasant.
Or a pheasant.
No. Finally, example number 5 comes from the book Big Timber, A Story of the Northwest by Bertrand W. Sinclair. Quote, Stella had overtaken her work and snared a fleeting hour of idleness in the mid-afternoon of a hot day in early August. Under a branchy alder, which is a type of tree, she piled all the pillows she could commandeer and curled herself upon them in grateful ease. Unquote. That sounds real nice, don't it? In this example, notice that the pillows weren't being used by someone else when she took them. Presumably, they were just lying about. But as we discussed, that's still commandeering. Okay, folks, that'll do it for the examples and for today's show. Thank you all so much for tuning in, and thank you, Emily, for joining us.
It's been my pleasure.
Well, we hope you enjoyed the program, and if you did, please do consider rating and reviewing it on iTunes, as this helps more fans of language find us. Or, again, if needed, just commandeer people's phones and subscribe them yourself. It's for the best. All right, for everyone here at the Word of the Day podcast, this is your host, Jamie Silva, saying so long from not the RAV4 studios. We'll see you next time, and until then, have a most pleasant day.